thank you so much for joining this evening and allowing me to share with you some of my thoughts about public monuments in the US, but also in some other places, as we'll see. I have been thinking about monuments for a long time. My area of research focuses on Italian and Spanish art history, sculpture specifically, in the Renaissance and Baroque time periods, so early modern, as we call it. But monuments obviously have been the focus of so much discussion and media coverage, and the target of protesters and governments have been grappling with what to do with monuments that just don't necessarily reflect values that we hold today. And so I've really been thinking about the relationship that I have with monuments in the various places that I've been fortunate to live, and really started thinking about especially the monuments that I grew up with in my hometown. And so I'm going to kind of thread all of these thoughts together for you, I hope in a coherent way, for the next little bit of time that we have together. But I guess on the outset, I just want to really emphasize that I think it's fascinating, the kind of relationship that publics have with monuments. I think it's been really interesting to see how the monuments in the American landscape in particular incite so much of an emotional reaction when we talk about their removal. That it can be something that makes people very upset to think about. And I think we need to question what our anxiety is about that and think about possible ways forward as we create new monuments and figure out what we do with old monuments. So that's really what I'm going to talk about this evening. So I'm going to start sharing my screen with you. I'm starting here with a monument in Italy. I lived in Italy for 7 years before coming to Vermont. And it was there that I really started doing very serious research about Italian Renaissance sculpture while I was getting my PhD, and thinking about the ways in which we, at that point, 20th century, interacted with statues from the 16th century, my area of expertise in particular. And this monument is in Livorno, Italy, which is a Tuscan seaport about an hour away from Florence. And it's a very vibrant seaport town. It's a very diverse town. And there's been a real growth of immigrants into Italy over the past few decades, and the population has very much diversified. And today there are African Italians who want to see the removal of this sculpture group. As an art historian, I certainly thought about the connection between these monuments and the audiences today, but I have to say, quite honestly, that I'd not really read them in this way. I was so used to thinking about them in terms of their 16th century audience, that it was an important sort of wake-up call for me, especially as protest rose over the last few years around monuments in Italy, but also in the US, and what to do with them. So for me, in a lot of ways, this sort of got my sort of intellectual juices going, thinking about these topics, along with the rise of protest, especially over the last summer, as we've seen. What we see here is the monument to Ferdinando I de' Medici, of the great Medici family of Renaissance patrons that really made the Renaissance happen in a lot of ways, particularly for Tuscany. Ferdinando had enacted had sort of initiated slave trade as another means of boosting the kind of failing economy of Tuscany in the 16th century. And this monument is meant to celebrate that. So we have Ferdinando, who is here, standing quite proudly, as you can see, with all the hallmarks of leadership, made of white marble by the artist Giovanni Bandini. And then around the base of the pedestal were added these figures of slaves done in bronze so that they would have a dark coloring to reflect their African heritage. And they have the facial types that would have been identifiable to a 16th century, early 17th century audience as coming from Africa. You can see that they do not have clothing. They are mostly nude figures. They're in these sort of crouching positions, and they're chained to the pedestal that Ferdinando stands on. So iconographically, it's super clear what the message is here of this victorious Medici man with these crouching slave figures at his feet. And clearly the delineation between white versus black is made here. So while this monument certainly has been questioned over the last few years, in particular especially by African Italians, it is important to note that this monument has long incited critiques and calls for its removal. And this is just one quote from a pretty early source from 1799 by Napoleon's general, when he calls for this monument, which he decries as being a monument to tyranny that insults humanity, where we see these four captives, as he said, chained to the pedestal and 100 times more courageous than the ferocious Ferdinando that treads on them. And that this monument has for hundreds of years offered a distressing spectacle as soon as one sets foot on the port. Feelings of pain, scorn, contempt, and hatred should necessarily disturb every sensible soul that approaches it. Let us avenge the injury done to humanity. You should be pleased, citizens, to order a Statue of Liberty to be substituted for one of that monster. Let one hand break the chains of the four slaves while the other smashes with a pick the head of Ferdinando spread out on the ground. And I bring this up, this quote is so stirring, I think, because again, it really sort of, sorry, I'll backtrack a little bit. It really sort of speaks to the kind of visceral reactions that we have with statuary, right? And I think some of the words that are used in 1799 are very much akin to the descriptions that we've heard Black Lives Matter activists speak regarding some of the statues that we see on American public lands and the sort of pain that they evoke in their viewers. I also come at this not just as a sculpture historian of the Renaissance and Baroque period, but also as a Southerner. I was raised in Martinsville, Virginia, and in Martinsville, like just about every city in town in Virginia, but in, well outside of Virginia as well, throughout the South and not just in the South, there are monuments that are meant to commemorate, or at least purportedly that's their function, of commemorating the Civil War. And in particular, commemorating the side of the Confederacy. So frankly, just on the outset, let me just say, it'd be one thing if these were just monuments to, the Union triumph, but no, that's not what we see dotting the landscape in the South. But this is the former courthouse. It's now the Martinsville Historical Society building. But it was a courthouse that where this monument of a Confederate soldier was erected by the Mildred Lee branch of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1901. And the relationship of this statue for me as a girl growing up in this town, seeing in front of the courthouse now when I look at it, I think, what in the heck? Why is there a monument to the defeated, who were the vanquished, set in front of the courthouse? What is that about? At the time, growing up in the South, this was totally normal. There are statues like this everywhere. And we didn't particularly question why we would have all of these monuments to the Confederacy, in part because of this group, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who still very much exist, who not only paid for the erection of these monuments all across the South and beyond, but they also edited our history textbooks, and they edited them to say, that the slaves were happy, they were happy members of the family, that it was the North that, as aggressors, that came and destroyed what had been this idyllic world of the South before the war. So that's, we all bought into that idea. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, these are all figures that were very much held up as the pinnacles of the ideal Southern gentleman, that had all the good Southern manners and all of that comes packaged within those ideas. So this is all something that we're just completely imbued with, being raised there. I don't think the UDC still edits the textbooks in Virginia. So progress has been made, but there's a whole, generations of us that were raised with these ideals. And even this summer, when there was discussion about some of these Confederate monuments, friends that I went to high school with, and even some that I went to college with, talked about how, how can we remove Robert E. Lee? He was just this sweet grandfatherly figure. Why would we want to do that? So, looking at how these monuments are placed and the things that we learn from being around monuments, and then coupled with what we're learning in the schools, seeing this monument in front of the courthouse, I now understand more what its function was. And it was placed in 1901. So we're not talking about the years right after the end of the Civil War in 1865, but decades later. And it was placed there right as important cases were being tried in courts across the country that would have enabled for greater civil rights, or further limited civil rights protections for these Black folks across the country who were no longer enslaved and sort of trying to make their way in society. And these are the Jim Crow years. It's when the lost cause that the United Daughters of the Confederacy wanted to purport really take root. These ideas about, happy slaves, Northern aggression, and so forth. So this monument in particular was put up by the Mildred Lee branch, which was the local branch of the UDC. So wealthy women in Martinsville who had enjoyed prestige in Martinsville society were happy to be a part of this group, and they saw their role as trying to protect and promote the ideals of the Southern legacy, right? But the monument and the courthouse delineate in Martinsville exactly where the Black part of the town is from the white part of town. Martinsville, like many cities, not just in the South again, but especially you see it in the South, are very much segregated. And remain so, though some of the lines in Martinsville have been blurred a little bit. They're still fully distinguishable as the Black side of town and the white side of town. The Black side of town starts over here on a street called Fayette Street. And on, in Fayette Street, it was a very rich and still is cultural center for the African-American community there. The Black folks were settling in this space right after they had been freed from slavery, but still, were oppressed in many, many ways. But they formed these communities where they had their churches, schools, restaurants, hotels, place to enjoy music. And it was quite a vibrant center for Black culture in town, and still is to some extent. So that is the part that you see that starts over here. It is a very poor part of town. That kind of oppression that had its roots in these years right after the slaves were freed and communities of Black folks start to settle in the towns. That kind of oppression has very long-lasting effects, and those are still very much visible in the town of Martinsville. On this side of the courthouse instead is where you start the downtown area with its shops and higher end shops that were intended for white folks to shop in, hotels, restaurants, and so forth. And then it sprawled from there to the very wealthy folks that lived in Martinsville. Martinsville famously had the highest highest amount of millionaires per capita in the country for a good part of time, especially in the 80s, though that certainly is not true any longer. It suffered a great deal of economic decline when manufacturing jobs were taken away from the area. So that placement of the monument in Martinsville and the sort of mapping that's created from that placement of the Confederate monument starkly in front of the courthouse, as I said, is not an anomaly by any means. In fact, it is the norm. In 12 southern states, there are 1,568 Confederate monuments in town squares, courthouse lawns, and in every state capitol building in the South. And this is still true. 1,000 of these monuments were placed in these Jim Crow years from 1890 and extending through those major civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s. When, say, for example, Brown versus Board of Education was tried, a bronze statue was placed in front of Robert E. Lee High School in Alabama, really meant to insinuate and make permanent the messages of the monument of Robert E. Lee in front of the school named after him to the children of color that would then be frequenting that school as schools became integrated. So, the messaging of it are just so very clear and what their intentions are. There were 27 Confederate monuments added in Texas and 16 more across the South right after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. So we really see the connection between, rights either being challenged or, being gained and the additions of these monuments across the South, but not just in the South, as I keep saying, because there are Confederate monuments in Maine, Oregon, New York, Wisconsin, Montana, places that had nothing to do with the Confederacy. And so those two were placed when, these rights were being either gained or challenged, and their messaging, therefore, is pretty clear. The Southern Poverty Law Center has, in fact, mapped out exactly how this phenomenon worked and has mapped when, starting from the formation of the Ku Klux Klan in 1866, in this era of Reconstruction in the South. And then you start to see, there's a lag until we really start to have this huge jump of number of monuments that are being made, especially placed on courthouse grounds, but also placed elsewhere. In the years when, say, the NAACP was founded, when the Klan resurges, like in 1915, then, say, things sort of ebb a little bit, and then the Tulsa race riots happen, and then there is another surge of monuments being constructed or schools being named after Confederate generals and so forth. So, it's a really good graph, I think, to show exactly the correlation between these monuments and what was going on elsewhere in society. So the UDC, as I mentioned, still exists. Their headquarters are in Richmond, Virginia, which we'll turn to in just a moment. In 2018, so only 2 years ago, they reiterated that their mission, as they see it, is to honor the memory of the Confederate ancestors, protecting, preserving, and marking the places made historic by Confederate valor, collecting and preserving the material for a truthful history of the war between the states. I think the key phrasing in here is the truthful history of the war between the states, because that's not what the UDC tries to promote. It is that false narrative of Northern aggression that ruined the happiness of the slaves and on the plantations of the South. So in Richmond, in the main part of downtown, there is this area called the Fan District, a beautiful part of Richmond, landscaped, as you can see, with this wide center median that is marked by a series of monuments and is thereby named Monument Avenue. Monument Avenue is done in the same time period, starting in 1890, so decades after the end of the Civil War. And this series of monuments is all of the important Civil War generals, or at least that's how it started, and then some other statues related to the Confederacy were added there subsequently. In thinking about how we see the connection between these monuments and the landscape that they mark, just like in Martinsville, how the monument to the Confederacy in front of the courthouse, mapped out the poor Black area from the wealthy white area. In the documents of the sale of properties along Monument Avenue, it stated that no person of color would ever be able to buy property along Monument Avenue, that this had to be an exclusively white part of town. And the statues just, are fully in conversation with those ideas about white supremacy and maintaining, the pristineness of this space as a white space. So, it's because of these ideals that are connected to these statues and the fact that Monument Avenue and Richmond specifically is such a diverse city, and it is the capital of the state of Virginia. It has been the target of much discussion over the last few years as folks try to figure out what to do with these statues. There are those, of course, who don't want to see anything happen to these statues, think that they should stay exactly in place as they are and always have been, and they will decry that we are erasing history by removing these statues. But I think it's super important to think about the true context of these monuments, which is, again, that they were made decades after the Civil War. Robert E. Lee himself, who is figured along these monuments of Monument Avenue, had said very clearly that no statues to the Confederacy should be made, and especially of himself. And he certainly felt like the money should be spent in the rebuilding of the South instead of erecting monuments. But he was also very concerned about putting up monuments to the defeated heroes, right? That it's a very strange thing in the history of monuments to have monuments put up to the vanquished instead of to the victors. So it doesn't even reflect the ideals that Robert E. Lee himself had stated about these kinds of monuments. Here is the Robert E. Lee Monument. It was the first one to be put up in 1890. But, I think it's really important, along with thinking about the real context of these monuments, is to recognize that not everybody celebrated the placement of these statues on Monument Avenue, that, they certainly understood that the messaging of these monuments wasn't exactly appropriate for the time and the place in Richmond post-war. So, for example, in this column, a journalist for the Richmond Planet, a Black newspaper in Richmond, wrote literally as like the boxes are arriving with the statue of Robert E. Lee. And he writes that, with sort of shock that this arrival of the statue that was so celebratory in nature had no flags of the Union. Only the Confederate flag, was bedecking the arrival of the boxes. This is, in thinking about how it connected very clearly to the ideals of secession. And he stated specifically that it was an emblem of the lost cause, right? This whole fabricated ideal that the UDC and others were promoting. He asked, what does this display of Confederate emblems mean? What does it serve to teach the rising generations of the South? Why this placing of Lee on equality with Washington, Jackson, and with Marion, and Stuart with Light Horse Harry of other days? There is lacking in all this display the proper appreciation of the Union. There's evidence that the loyalty oft expressed, as in those who were saying, we're all for the Union now, penetrates no deeper than the surface. But naturally, there were others that celebrated the arrival of this monument. Archer Anderson, a Richmond industrialist who had been an officer for the Confederacy, said about the monument, it will teach generations yet unborn and stand as the embodiment of a brave and virtuous people's ideal leaders. He saw exactly how important this monument could be for teaching future generations to idolize Robert E. Lee and the other statues of other generals that were put up after that. So in 1919, the monument to Stonewall Jackson was placed there. So, we're at this point, we're getting well away from the time of, the Civil War. But there it went on Monument Avenue, but it was removed this summer as calls became more urgent for these statues to be removed. And, I think that, these statues, because of their tie to this painful part of Virginia's past, but also the very real continued struggle for racial equity across the country. These are painful statues, and we need to address that audience and how they view these statues in their public places. And again, as I said, Richmond is a very diverse place. Virginia is a very diverse state. And so that, we need to be willing to discuss and hear the voices of the people that their values don't align with these white supremacist emblems that still are in the center of the Capitol. And I would hope that that's most folks, but I'm afraid that may not be so. So the statue started to be removed only because Governor Northam of Virginia pushed back on a law that was in place that had been put up during the Jim Crow era, that no monument should be removed, and specifically monuments of the Confederacy should never be removed. So that had kind of, blocked potential movement of these sculptures for a long time, but he was able finally to be successful in having this change. So the monuments have been coming off of Monument Avenue over the last few months, but the one of Robert E. Lee still is very much in place. And because of folks who argue that we're erasing history by removing these monuments, that it continues to be in the courts with numerous appeals. And so the Robert E. Lee statue still stays in its place. And I'll come back to that what's going on with that a little bit later on. I want to emphasize, though, that one, the Confederate monuments are not just in the South, but also that this is not just a Southern problem. And we see problematic monuments elsewhere in the U.S. That we need to deal with. And the two that you're seeing here are sculptures of Junipero Serra. Serra was a Spanish missionary who arrived in the 17th century in California and set up missions as a Catholic. His intention of spreading the word of God as he understood it, and he set up these missions, and the missions were built by the indigenous people that were living in the area that essentially became enslaved or indentured to the mission. And they were treated very poorly, a great deal of violence against the indigenous peoples who, at the hands of these missionaries, not just Serra, but Serra has become maybe the most famous among these missionaries. He was only in 2015 made a saint of the Catholic Church. And there are monuments like the one that you see on the left that were put up just in the 1980s. So very recent. There are some others that are earlier, like the one you see on the right from 1936. And these line up exactly with the same years that indigenous peoples are fighting for their civil rights. They were fighting to be recognized as citizens and then to be able to enjoy the other rights that come along with citizenship. And clearly also trying to fight back for some of the land that they had been dispossessed from. So these monuments of Serra are put up in those years in front of the courthouses. So very much like what I just talked about in Martinsville. And they have started to be removed, like the ones of the Confederacy. Activists have been really pushing for their removal, and we're just starting to see some traction with that, with the removal of these monuments to Serra. But we see monuments elsewhere in the country, especially in federal areas, that I think we need to really critique. This is an image from when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was lying in state in the Capitol building not long ago. This is the Hall of Statues in the Capitol building. In this space, each state is allowed to have two statues that are meant to sort of represent the state. The one for Virginia is Robert E. Lee. But Governor Northam has pushed for that to be switched out for someone else, hopefully with some community input about who that should be. But there are others of men of the Confederacy. There's one of Junipero Serra, who we just saw in California. And, I think it's really striking to think about these monuments in our federal building, in the Capitol building, monuments to especially these Confederate generals who were fighting against what the Capitol building represents in the unity of our country. And, I thought it was really striking to see Ruth Bader Ginsburg lying in state here, surrounded by some of these men who fought for values that were positively anathema to the values that Ruth Bader Ginsburg fought so hard for in her long and distinguished career. So, I think it's important for us to think about who these men are that are so acclaimed by having a position here in the federal building. And, again, I would reiterate that my issue is not with sculptures, monuments that people place in private spaces. People can do whatever they want to, private spaces, churches included in that. But I do think when we're talking about federal and state properties, that the people should have a real say in what's there, and whether these are still men that we and women that we wish to celebrate in such a distinguished way. Just to give a little bit of context on the sculpture that is in this space that represents North Carolina, there is a sculpture of Charles Aycock. And Charles Aycock was a man who was in Wilmington and performed the only coup d'etat that's ever happened in American history, when these white men that he led overtook the government that was in Wilmington. And he later became governor of the state of North Carolina. And when he was nominated, he gave this speech, which I'm going to quote a little bit from, just to give you a real sense of what Aycock stood for, and whether, perhaps this is someone we should critique a bit more in our federal building. He said, "When we say that the Negro is unfit to rule, we carry it one step further and convey the correct idea when we declare that he is unfit to vote. To do this, we must disenfranchise the Negro. This movement comes from the people. Politicians have been afraid of it and have hesitated, but the great mass of white men in the state are now demanding and have demanded that the matter be settled once and for all. To do so is both desirable and necessary. Desirable because it sets the white man free to move along faster than he can go when retarded by the slower movement of the Negro." Is this the kind of person we want to have given this place of pride in our federal building? I should think not, but a executive order was issued over the summer by President Trump, in which he demands that no sculpture be removed from any federal or state-owned property, though he doesn't actually have jurisdiction over state sites. But he said that if states didn't do what they needed to do to protect these statues that were the target of protesters, that he would send in reinforcements, as we saw him do already in some cities like Portland. So the idea of these removal of statues is clearly a very tricky one, and incites a lot of volatile sort of reaction. And I think that's just getting intensified, to be honest. I think while we can think about the removal of statues, the ones in the federal building and the Capitol building are pretty easy to remove, frankly. They are portable in their own way, but there are some that are problematic and that have been carved into our national landscape. And I show you two perfect examples of that, both of these done by Gutzon Borglum. We have Mount Rushmore, of course, on the left, and Stone Mountain, Georgia on the right. So Mount Rushmore was what was and is sacred Lakota Sioux land of Black Hills. And this land was taken from the Lakota Sioux, and the project of engraving these former presidents into the mountain was done, frankly, not above board. And it clearly was done exactly in the years, again, where Native Americans are fighting for their rights, and it permanently inscribed the presence of white men into their sacred space, which I think is a pretty stark and clear message. In the case of Stone Mountain, Georgia, I think it's especially striking to me that this monument was only completed in 1970, the year before I was born. So I certainly don't think about that as being, in the distant past. But it was, again, an important Native American site, in this case, the Cherokee and Crete Confederation. It was dispossessed land as of the 1820s, and there was a plan starting in the first decades of the 1900s to do something, to do a monument of some sort to the Confederacy here, as this monument craze was happening across the country by the UDC. And in fact, it was the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, that paid for this work to be completed. And they were especially interested in commemorating this site because it is the site where the second resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan took place. And the UDC is totally intertwined with the Ku Klux Klan. They are the ones that help frame the ideas of these white knights and so forth, using sort of chivalric ideals as they talk about them. But it was the UDC that paid for this to be done. And these are the Confederate generals that we see here on horseback, again, permanently inscribed into this landscape, that it's kind of hard to know how we can think about these, particularly this one to the Confederacy. How can we give this greater context when it so dominates the landscape around Stone Mountain? There are other statues, though, that are much easier to sort of see where the problems are and remove them. And that's certainly evident here in this example of a statue of Christopher Columbus that is at the Boston waterfront. So, certainly we have some problematic monuments in New England. And Christopher Columbus is just one of the sort of problematic men that we see being given this sort of monumental treatment. Columbus certainly never made it to Boston, no connection there. And this monument was done in 1979, so not exactly a great historic piece. And I won't even talk about how poor the artistic quality is, but I'm hoping you can kind of get a sense of that yourselves. But it was placed in Boston. The Italian-American community in Boston feels very strong ties to Columbus, and this connection between Italian-Americans and the kind of historical mythology around Columbus has been a powerful thing since the late 19th century. And this, the drive for the Italian-Americans to make this connection to Columbus is that they very much suffered discrimination. They were very much a marginalized community in all of the different locations where they settled as they immigrated here, especially between the wars, a few decades later. But they, really suffered under, there were lynchings that took place of Italians. They weren't allowed to have certain jobs or eat in certain places. So they really did face some really aggressive discrimination. The Italian-Americans kind of grasp onto Columbus as a way to have an origin story about their presence in America, no matter how fraught this story was in terms of its truth. Again, Columbus didn't actually come here. But, to make a connection to him was important and continues to be important for some Italian Americans. There are many organizations of Italian Americans that celebrate Columbus and Columbus Day, right? But of course, in Vermont, we know how difficult that story of Columbus is, especially for our indigenous peoples. And in Vermont, of course, we no longer celebrate Columbus Day, but Indigenous Peoples Day. And, I think we understand pretty well how complicated this relationship of Americans is with Columbus from the side of the Italian Americans, but also from indigenous people and their allies. And I just think it's an important example of, really thinking about all sides of this and understanding, what Columbus represents for Italian Americans, and what can we do with that legacy and that heritage as the Italian Americans see it. But then also, how do we deal with the pain that images like this one of Columbus can cause for Native peoples who suffered not directly under the hands of Columbus, but of the waves of the white Europeans who came after his discovery. And you can see in June of this year, protesters decided to take his head off as a real clear message about how they felt about this statue. Again, I don't see it as a great artistic loss, but I do think, it causes pain on both sides, and it's important for us to think about our relationship with these statues in that way. Another statue that I would call to your attention is this one of the Emancipation Monument, which was made by Thomas Ball. It's a fascinating history of this monument because it was actually paid for by newly freed former slaves that were living in Washington, D.C. They pulled their money together and had this monument put up as a gesture to show thanks to Abraham Lincoln for his role in that. Of course, he's the standing figure above. And then we see this crouching, almost completely nude figure of an African American underneath him, which represents these newly freed slaves. The chain that is binding him is being broken so that we fully understand the purpose of this monument. When the monument was inaugurated, Frederick Douglass was there and gave a moving speech about it, but he later wrote a sort of op-ed piece about this monument. And I think what he said is really important. He said, "What I want to see before I die is a monument representing the Negro, not couchant on his knees like a four-footed animal, but erect on his feet like a man." And what Frederick Douglass was really calling for was more monuments to be put up in this space so that there could be greater diversity of the kind of representation there to show, a man like Frederick Douglass that had been so successful despite everything, that would show a sort of progression, right, about what this freedom that was gathered here allowed for by the next generations of Black folks. So this is an interesting monument, though, because one, that context was never given. No monuments were put here that kind of helped balance out the image that we see here. And the African American community in DC and a copy of this monument was actually made and put in Boston, have criticized and this monument today and talk about it as being painful to see. Because it does follow this same sort of trope of representation of the standing, heroic white man who, helps this pretty pathetic, almost animalistic, even as Douglass has said, man below him, and really emphasizes that a difference there between the power of the white man and the Black man. So the one in Boston has actually been removed. The one in DC remains, but there is talk about adding now more sculptures to that group to give it some balance. So that brings us to thinking about what the options are moving forward. My biggest point, I think, is to bring art historians and historians into the conversation. The conversation needs to happen, and we need to make sure those conversations happen around these problematic monuments. But we need art historians and historians to do research and provide information about the history of the moment when they were created, who paid for them, how they were received in their own historical moment, how they've been described since then, and how they might impact the viewer today. But also we need to bring in public voices. We need to allow community members to, say when a sculpture or monument is not enjoyed by them to see in their public spaces any longer, and be willing to think about monuments as not necessarily being permanent, that they can either be given context or they can be removed and something else can be put into their place. We need to expand the scope and really think through, the histories of the monuments that we have in our landscape, and be willing to have those conversations, as I said. Then we need to be able to either add monuments, give commissions to artists that can add monuments to the site, to either counter the message or give them greater context, or celebrate other values that perhaps are longer lasting. We can add plaques to educate about the history and meaning of those sites, which is something that was suggested for Monument Avenue in Richmond. Before they decided to remove them, the idea was that plaques would be added. The truth is, hardly anyone reads plaques. We know that from studies of museums and object labels, that people don't usually read them, actually. So that's kind of a not an easy or particularly effective solution to the problem. We can remove them and put them in museums, battleground cemeteries, or memorial parks. There are some issues with that. Museums usually don't have space for these things. Battleground cemeteries or memorial park, I think, makes perfect sense, especially for the Confederate monuments. We can have artists to think about how to reappropriate their imagery or reactivate these works through graffiti, projections, or other artistic interventions. And in some cases, we just need to be willing to let these monuments go. A lot of these monuments were just mass produced and don't have artistic or material value. There are thousands of them. We can't possibly keep all of them and shove them all into a museum. There would be no real purpose in that. So we can look to other countries and see what they've done with their challenging monuments as time changes. This is a great example of that. This is Memento Park in Budapest in Hungary. And they, as communism fell, they removed the statues of communism into this park where they're all collected. You can see that they, have these brick bases. They're not sort of beautifully displayed, and that's kind of part of the point. But to have them all here and really give context to, what the values of communism were, but also how and why communism fell, and why did it fall when it did, and what are the values of Budapest today, right? So that's one option. Fred Wilson offers another possibility, which is to do these sort of interventions. As he's done, this is the first one that he did in 1992, but he's done many in different museums since then. But he did this project called Mining the Museum in the Maryland Historical Society, and he went through and looked at, what objects are on display in museums, where, what stories are they not telling, and what narrative is coming out of what is displayed. And so he really went through, in this case, and brought out some objects that hadn't been on display and gave them greater context. But what we're seeing here, I think, is pretty striking. We've got sculptures here of Henry Clay, Napoleon, and Andrew Jackson. Napoleon, of course, had nothing to do with Maryland, but is here represented. And then we don't have sculptures of Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, or Benjamin Banneker, all of whom do have a connection with Maryland, obviously important figures of color, and they're not represented in the Maryland Historical Society. So he asks us to think about that, right? And I think we can translate this into our public spaces. Who is not represented? And by not representing them, what narrative are we continuing, right? To look at an example of how artists are interacting with these problematic sculptures. This is a great example of that. Dustin Klein has been doing projections onto the Robert E. Lee Monument. These kind of rotate, and he'll make new projections of different figures. This one obviously showing George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. He did one for Pride. He's done several different ones, but it really activates the monument. And the protesters, the Black Lives Matter protesters, really used this space of Monument Avenue as kind of a new site that they appropriated, right? And the way these projections work and the graffiti that covers the pedestal now really reactivates this monument and makes it relevant when it no longer was in so many ways. But I think it's a beautiful kind of intervention on the part of the artist to do it this way. I should point out that there had been an earlier attempt to give context, not just plaques, as I mentioned earlier, but there was a statue put up of Arthur Ashe on Monument Avenue, famed tennis player that came from Richmond, an African-American man. It's a very small statue. It certainly was not on sort of the monumental level of these monuments, and really didn't help along the sort of conversation about the roles and lives of the important Black community in Richmond. Kehinde Wiley has come up with a new way to give some context to Monument Avenue. He did this amazing sculpture called The Rumors of War. And in it, we don't see it's not a monument to a particular man, but it interacts with the ideas and trauma of war. And we see that he has taken the sort of motif of the equestrian monument, like Robert E. Lee's, but here has activated the horse, so it's a much more animated sort of sculpture. But he's put on horseback a identifiably contemporary African-American who is, getting ready to charge down Monument Avenue. It's a really pretty stirring monument that Kehinde Wiley gave to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts to put on Monument Avenue. Kehinde Wiley, in his dedication of this statue we just saw, said, in these toxic times, art can help us transform and give us a sense of purpose. The story begins with my seeing the Confederate monuments. What does it feel like if you're Black and walking beneath this? We come from a beautiful fractured situation. Let's take these fractured pieces and put them back together. And I think that's an important call for all of us as we see our country so polarized right now, and even polarized around what to do with these monuments. Monuments, of course, continue to be made, but I think we need to be very careful about monuments moving forward, understanding that our values evolve. And either we need to be, as I said, willing to sort of let them go when they run their course, or we need to maybe move to making monuments to ideals instead of to men. Frank Gehry just unveiled, maybe just a month or so ago, this new monument to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Gehry is one of the greatest architects of our time. It's really an incredible, monument visually to Eisenhower. But, having studied the history of monuments, I do wonder about, how long it will be before we find something that, in fact, we don't like about Dwight Eisenhower's legacy and no longer feel comfortable with. But I think that should make us think about, where do we draw the line? Who is it that determines when we are no longer comfortable with these monuments, or what sort of the deal breaker is in celebrating the legacy of a particular person? I love more conceptual pieces as monuments, like this National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which Brian Stevenson really has been the seminal figure in making this happen. And if you haven't read his book, Just Mercy, I highly recommend it. This was done by Mass Design Group. It's a monument that is meant to sort of force reflection on the part of the viewer about the many African Americans who were lynched, and in these different sort of pillars that you see that are extended from the ceiling are clearly meant to cause that reflection. I would say that, you know, we should be looking around our own spaces here in Vermont to see if some of the sculptures that are around here reflect our ideals. Vermont, a pretty progressive place, but one I've found to be fairly reluctant to want to change in a lot of ways. And you know, there are monuments that were put up not even that long ago. In 2009 with the celebrations around Samuel de Champlain. Several monuments were put up to memorialize Champlain. And one that you're seeing here that's on the far right is on Isle La Motte. And we see the same kind of trope being used here of the standing victorious white man and the crouching nude or partially nude indigenous person beneath him. And given Vermont's problematic history with its relations with its Native American peoples, I think, you know, I would call for us to at least have a conversation about monuments like that. Champlain, I know, had, you know, supposedly had good relations with the Native Americans here, but the iconography of this statue doesn't really suggest that they are being shown here, at least, as being his equals, right? I mean, just if we look at the history of sculpture and look at the standing figure and the low figure below, that iconography is meant to suggest a particular kind of hierarchy that I think needs to be grappled with. So I think I will end there and see if there's plenty more I could say, but I want to allow some time for some dialogue and be able to answer questions if you're so inclined to have some questions.
There's a couple of questions already in the chat box. The first question is from Pam and Alan, and it says, Stone Mountain has put up in its museum the facts you discussed. Do you believe there is historical correct context that monuments should remain?
I mean, I think that I think Stone Mountain's a tricky one to deal with, right? Because it is so monumental and so permanently into the landscape, which of course is totally intentional on the part of the people that paid for it to be done, that it, you know, what do you do with it? I mean, you can give context on the site there with labels, plaques, other sort of historical information. But I think, you know, it takes historians and a public that are really willing to dig into the true history of what happened at Stone Mountain and the way that the imagery at Stone Mountain still is very painful for, particularly for the African Americans, but also the Native Americans that live in that area. You know, we should respect that, you know, and whether that can be done with some labels in or plaques, I'm not so sure.
Mm-hmm. And I think the next question you touched on, it says, where should the statues that are removed from public spaces be put?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there isn't a set answer. I think it really needs to be a conversation and a plan made that people can all be on board with, which is not an easy thing to achieve, and I think that's why it's taken so long for Charlottesville or Richmond in Virginia to do something about these monuments. And it does have the capacity to incite violence when the discussions about removing statues are made. So needless to say, local authorities are reluctant to have that happen. I mean, look at what happened in Charlottesville. It's a very difficult conversation, but surely we can find ways to agree on some statues, some monuments being placed in spaces that preserves them, but no longer glorifies their presence in public spaces.
Mhm.
And to me, that's the key. Whether, again, most museums don't have the capacity or the ability to house these humongous statues. Many of them are huge, right? So, museums is maybe what seems like the easy answer, but it's actually not at all an easy answer. I think there are many other possibilities of, especially the Confederate monuments. Civil War battlefields are a huge tourist attraction in the South, not just in the South. But they are a huge tourist attraction. And at least it provides that context. Like, here are the Civil War generals, the Confederate generals, and here is the battlefield where they fought. I think Gettysburg does that well. It tells both sides of the story, at least. I mean, not all of them I'm totally on board with, but the story is at least given both sides, and that's not what you get when you go to these Confederate sites. It is very much one side of the story about the glorious South and what we lost, and that the South will rise again, and all of that stuff, right?
Another question: what if government sold the properties to private groups? Would that solve a problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think if it's private space, then we don't have much jurisdiction over that, right? But would people be okay with our government selling off, the center of the city of Richmond? I hope not, because that seems highly problematic. I think in some cases, I think we need to create those spaces for, the UDC, who paid for all of these monuments to be put up. The UDC needs to figure out what to do with them. And whether that is that the UDC creates a kind of memorial park or a memento park like we saw in Budapest, or something else, so be it, but I just think my issue is with public spaces where, these monuments that are in public spaces should be a reflection of what our public values are, what our aspirations are. I mean, that is generally why monuments are erected, right? And when we no longer feel that way, when those are no longer the values that reflect what we value today, and maybe they never actually did reflect the values, we need to be willing to move on and do something else with them. And artists need work. Let's let our contemporary artists make some new monuments.
True. Are there other controversial monuments in Vermont we should talk about?
Yeah, so I think UVM, where I am currently coming to you from, certainly has a difficult relationship with a difficult history in its relationship to the eugenics movement. And I think what I would point out is that we have a lot of absence of discussion about UVM's role in the eugenics movement. We have a real absence of the fact that the UVM campus is situated on what was Abenaki land. I mean, there's a lot of absence, right? And we say a lot in the silence on these things, I think. You know, our students who are so engaged and you know, activist in all the ways we would hope our young folks are, called for UVM to engage more with its past, and called for the renaming of what was the Bailey Howe Library is now the Howe Library, precisely because of Bailey's relationship to the eugenics movement. There are other examples of prominent Vermonters that were also involved in the eugenics movement in one way or another. And I mean, does that mean we tear them all down and not talk about them anymore? No, but we do need to give the full history of who they were as people. We can put it in the context of, you know, this is what they believed was right at the time. However, we now know, like, eugenics actually not an okay way to treat Native Americans. You know, there needs to be greater complexity in how we revere, you know, Dorothy Fisher, or, you know, there's a ton of examples of folks that were involved in some way in the eugenics movement. You know, I'm sure there will be, you know, 50 years from now, there will be new values and new monuments that are put up that people aren't comfortable with anymore. And I think that's okay. I mean, surely as a people, we want to evolve, right? And we've got to be willing to do that. And that may mean taking down some of our monuments or renaming our buildings.
How did Confederate statues end up in the North, and where are they?
Ain't that the truth? I think that was one of the most surprising things that I have learned about as I've started to really get into these Confederate monuments, is that Montana, Kentucky, Maine, I mean, what in the heck? Why in the world do they have Confederate monuments there? And they were paid for by the UDC. So same group. And it is a way to spread the same ideology. And it really shows how disconnected it is from commemorating the Civil War, right? It's clearly about the values associated with that, you know, white supremacy and how these men became to embody that, right? So yeah, Madison, Wisconsin. Who would have thunk it, right? But yeah, there are these Confederate monuments throughout the country in places that weren't even states when the Civil War took place. So yeah, I think that proves in a lot of ways what the function of those Confederate monuments actually is.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any questions?
None in Vermont, as far as I know. I mean, I don't think there are any Confederate monuments here in Vermont. So we got that on our side. And I'd say a heck of a lot more. Yeah.
I don't see any more questions coming up. So I want to thank you. That was fantastic. Really interesting.
Well, thank you. And I am thrilled to see my fellow Essex Junction neighbors and friends of my mom and dad's, and my mom and dad are also on here, but I see Gail and I see lots of other folks, and I'm just super grateful for your interest in this subject, and for you coming here after, you know, what was for so many of us a very long night last night. So I'm very grateful to you for giving me your time this evening.